I think the challenge right now is that the side of the ledger that supports the thesis that this came from a zoonotic source, from an animal source, hasn't budged. And the side of the ledger that suggests that this could have come out of a lab has been continuing to grow. So people a year ago who said, well, this probably came from nature, it's really unlikely it came from a lab, maybe a year ago that kind of a statement made a lot of sense because that was the more likely scenario. But we haven't found the intermediate host. We found no evidence of this virus in an animal anywhere. The closest homology we found is a pangolin outbreak that occurred in March of 2019. But we haven't found the true source of the virus. And with MERS and SARS, at this point with those outbreaks, those epidemics, we had found the intermediate host. And it's not for lack of trying. There has been an exhaustive search for what the animal host was for this virus, and it hasn't been found. So I think the ledger on the side of the lab continues to grow. And the question for a lot of people is going to be, when are too many coincidences too much? When does it just seem that there's too many things suggesting that this could have come out of a lab? And right now, you know, there's more and more circumstantial evidence, certainly. I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of this, because unless we have a whistleblower, assuming it did come out of a lab, and I'm not saying it did, but assuming it did, unless we have a whistleblower, regime change in China, you're not going to truly find out. If there are retained samples from those people who were infected in that lab, I don't think they're available anymore.
Yeah, China's going to cover this up, obviously. So we can't rely on what China has. But note this, whenever someone hears about circumstantial evidence, most people go to prison because of circumstantial evidence. Usually you don't have an eyewitness in a criminal case. Usually it's, okay, what do we have? You have a lot of circumstantial evidence piled together, and that's enough to go beyond a reasonable doubt. Usually you don't have an eyewitness. You don't have you don't have the so-called smoking gun. And that's why when you see how this is going right now, how this is trending, it becomes apparent very quickly that Democrats were using this for political reasons in the 2020 year against Trump. Didn't want people to think more about this. Didn't want people to dig into it, and were willing to believe the WHO. The WHO is showing up, and this is like, you know, this is like dealing with Saddam and the weapons inspectors, right? One of the things that we did know is Saddam wasn't being honest with the weapons inspectors. Whether you believe that he got rid of all of it or only some of it, I mean, there was a lot of stuff happening there. Do you think the WHO is going to get real access to the data from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Here's some of the circumstantial evidence that, and I just want to also point out, social media shut down lab leak theory stuff. Okay? Social media, like Facebook, said you could not put that theory out there. Now, why? Why were they so sensitive? Because this was part of the Trump was wrong, and it was so important to people that Trump was wrong about the China virus. And beyond that, they also didn't want this to be used for xenophobia, or they were worried about attacks on Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. Interesting study that just came out, at least in New York City, of hate crimes. Over 90% against the Asian American community. Not from white guys. That was just in Campus Reform over the weekend. A study out of the UC system, University of California system, about New York City hate crimes. 90% plus attacks, hate crimes of any kind against Asian Americans in New York City. Not white guys. But yet, what did we hear for a little while from the media? Right, lies, because they lie to you all the time. So now the lab leak theory, back to where we are on this, is getting greater credibility, greater focus, because you have a number of people who came down with severe illness from the lab in about October, November 2019. That's what you call a pretty big coincidence, isn't it? And what we know from this virus is it is highly contagious. So if a couple of people had it in the lab, how easy do you think it is in China before anybody was worried about COVID? You think that they're not in close quarters with a whole bunch of folks going to the store, at home? Come on. And as the New York Post writes it here, this particular coronavirus showed up seemingly out of nowhere, perfectly suited to attack humans. Would be quite the mystery if it hadn't first popped up in a city with 2 virology institutes that were studying bat coronaviruses. That's right. I mean, this could have come, if it was a zoonotic transmission issue, it could have come from a wet market anywhere in China, because they're all over China. an unfortunate vestige of the era of Mao's Marxism, where people were starving to death. And so they started raising wild animals for food, and then it became a cultural practice. This is true. This is how the wet markets got going. Bats and lizards and pangolins and whatever, they started capturing and breeding wild animals for food because Mao's practices for agriculture and farming and animal husbandry were so bad that there was mass starvation during the famine, Mao's Great Famine. 40 to 60 million people died. So they were just grabbing whatever they could, understandably, to survive. And then it just became a cultural practice. And then it was worth hundreds of millions of dollars because there were also these ideas of rural agricultural and peasant medicine, where people would just say, oh, if you eat this, it'll cure this, or if you do this, it'll give you greater vitality or whatever, virality. And so people started eating these weird animals in China, and then it grew into a big practice. But this didn't happen. There are these wet markets all over China, so-called wet markets. This didn't happen in just any old place. It happened in one where there were two institutes, one in particular that was studying back coronaviruses and gain-of-function research. We go back to the beginnings of this. We go back to Occam's razor like a chainsaw on this one. What makes sense, what doesn't? What adds up and what seems like nonsense? And when you apply this to the origin theory, you can also start to apply this to everything else that they've been demanding of you about COVID, all the other claims they've made. We're beating this virus by masking up. Yeah, sure. We've seen what happens when people are not allowed to not only think for themselves, but communicate freely. This was a tyranny test, friends, and it is one that the Western world failed.
Hey, Team Buck, thank you so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you like this video, please click that little thumbs up button so then it will log as liked. And also, if you want to see more great content from The First, please click subscribe.